Montreal. Ooh, Hamilton. Quite a few from Canada. Excellent, excellent. All right, so let's go ahead and dive in. Thank you, everyone, for joining me. I'm Tim Grey, of course. Thanks for joining me for another presentation, online webinar presentation, as part of GreyLearning Live, this time focused on optimizing detail in photos. More on that, of course, in just a moment. If there was any confusion, I hope not, if there was any confusion as to who you were going to listen to today in this presentation, I'm Tim Grey. You might know me from my Ask Tim Grey email newsletter, which over 22 years now it's been. So about 22 and a half years, if memory serves. It's a long time to try and keep track of how long it's been going, but it's going strong. Thank you for all of you that allow me into your email inbox every weekday morning with a question from a photographer and my answer. If you're not already getting that email, you can go to asktimgrey.com, and there's a field over on the right-hand side where you can sign up so you can get those daily emails. And of course, my GreyLearning website, video training courses, more on that in just a second. In fact, more on that right now, because I've published quite a few comprehensive courses recently focused on Adobe Bridge is the most recent course, as well as Photoshop and Lightroom Classic, and even the cloud-based version of Lightroom, which now I have to come up with a new way of describing it because it's not just cloud-based. The formerly cloud-focused, I guess, version of Lightroom now enables you to manage local files as well. But you can learn about all of those courses just by pointing your web browser to greylearning.com. And also starting on Monday, which coincidentally happens to be my birthday, but I won't be presenting on my birthday because I got the day off, thankfully. I'll start on Tuesday the 21st. But the Lightroom Virtual Summit will be happening next week, May 20th through the 24th, Monday through Friday. I have 3 presentations that I'll be giving, 3 classes, I guess I should say, that I'll be giving during the event, and those will be on Lightroom Classic, all 3 on Lightroom Classic. So managing folders and collections, which I know is a topic a lot of photographers have a tendency to get a little bit confused about. I'll also talk about Lightroom Classic and the cloud, how you can select photos that you want to have available from virtually anywhere via the internet. And I'll also have a session on advanced color adjustments. So that will be, well, lots of fun for me. I hope fun and informative for you. You can get a free ticket. Just go to timgreyphoto.com/Lightroom24, and you can get the details. Sign up for a free pass or take a look at the VIP pass option that will give you forever access to recordings of all of the classes, as well as class notes from all of the instructors and some other bonus content. For those of you that joined me a little bit early today before we really got started, I already mentioned you can submit questions during the day today. This is really the best way. I know the chat gets to be a little bit popular at times, but it tends to be difficult for me to keep up with because I've got so many things going on while presenting. But if you fill out the form here, so timgrey.me/question, that will take you to a Google form. You can fill in, if you want, totally optional, you can put your name and email address. Most importantly is put your question into that form. But if you do include your email address and I'm not able to get to the question today, then I will do my best to follow up via email, perhaps include that in an Ask Tim Grey email newsletter in the coming days and or weeks, as the case may be. And I see Rick, another Middle Tennessee, Brentwood, Tennessee, just up the road from me here. All right, so welcome. Thanks again, everyone. And so we're going to talk about optimizing detail in photos. I should hasten to add right from the start, when I show you the optimization side of things, I'm going to use Lightroom Classic, but do keep in mind that the same adjustments are available in Camera Raw. If you're just a Photoshop user without using Lightroom Classic, it's also the same set of adjustments that are available in the cloud-focused version of Lightroom, the non-classic version of Lightroom, shall we say. And so you'll be able to translate all of the adjustments I'm going to be talking about will be equally applicable in those other software applications. And I also will point out that if you're using Photoshop, keep in mind that you do have Camera Raw as a filter available in Photoshop. So it's not just when you're initially processing your raw capture, you can also use the Camera Raw filter from the filter menu. I see, Santa Barbara wine country. I used to live nearby. Thank you for joining us. More Ohio. I think we're getting very strong representation. I guess I'm popular in Ohio, and I didn't even Didn't even realize it. All right, so let's get started here talking about detail. And first and foremost, the importance of detail. Now, I know I'm sure I'm guilty of this, whenever we're talking about a particular topic, we make it sound like that's the most important thing in photography. I don't know that I would call detail the most important thing, but it is really important that we have nice detail in our photos. And part of this is making a decision about whether we'll reveal a lot of information in the shadows, for example, versus maybe hiding some of that information. I'll give you some examples. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment when we get to some of the images. And so, detail, in a lot of ways, or in some cases at least, it really can make the photo. And so keep in mind also that, and I think especially when it comes to optimizing, that detail in a photo is by and large defined by variations in tonal values. And that's worth sort of keeping top of mind, or at least in the back of your mind, that it's tonal values that we're going to be adjusting when we're adjusting detail. And we'll see some ways that we can focus our attention on different tonal ranges within the image, for example. I think it's also worth keeping in mind that sometimes we might intentionally sacrifice detail in a photo. This photo, for example, does not have a lot of texture or detail because it's blurry, but it's intentionally blurry. This is a sort of making lemonade out of lemons type of situation. It was a really windy day out in the Palouse, and that does not bode well for photographing flowers outdoors. And so you sort of just double down on the wind. The flowers, these are canola flowers here, bouncing around with the wind. And so I just stopped down, and in this case actually used a neutral density filter, if I remember correctly, in order to get a bit longer exposure so I could intentionally lose some detail. So detail can be important. Sometimes it's less important. Sometimes it's more important. The key is that when you want that detail, you want to make sure that you're doing everything you can to really optimize the detail in your photos. So sometimes we might want to lose detail intentionally, but that would be a subject for another webinar presentation. And then, of course, as with everything in photography, I think it's important to start at the beginning. And when it comes to photography, I think it's important to start in the camera, essentially. So optimizing detail in the camera. I saw a comment go by here about blown highlights, that it just kind of is an amateur or rookie mistake, which I do agree with. Obviously, with specular highlights, we'll cut you some slack, and it's okay to lose some detail. I see Irwin there, by the way. Hey, Irwin, thanks for joining today. But we want to try and optimize in the camera, which means a few things. We saw with the motion blur, for example, so wanting to make sure that we have a stable platform for the camera. Ideally, I always recommend using a tripod, even though I rarely use a tripod myself in much of my photography. But a stable platform, whether it's you just stabilizing yourself or stabilizing the camera with a tripod or a monopod or a beanbag or whatever support you've got available. And then making sure that you're using an adequately fast shutter speed for the circumstances, possibly using image stabilization if your camera and or lens support that, so that you can help further stabilize the image. And adequate depth of field can be important, getting the focus in the right place, and a good overall exposure as well. So trying to make sure that you're doing the things in the camera that will help make sure that you have enough detail after the fact. So your shutter speed, your depth of field, using an optimal lens aperture for sharpness. As a very general rule, most lenses are going to be their sharpest when they're stopped down by approximately 2 stops from wide open, which is in many respects where the whole f8 and being there notion came up, because with many lenses, f8 is right about that 2 or 3 stops down from wide open, and that in terms of refraction, that'll give us the minimum amount of loss of sharpness effectively. It's generally the sharpest aperture setting for a given lens. Not always exactly the same from lens to lens, but a pretty good rule of thumb in that regard. So just making sure, and even choosing which lens you're going to use. Using a macro lens whenever possible, not just for macro. If you've got a 100mm macro lens, that's a great 100mm landscape lens, because a macro lens, it's capable of focusing close, but it can focus far away too in most cases, and they're very often the sharpest lenses that are available. And so choosing a lens for its sharpness. Obviously, you have to take other factors into account, such as focal length, etc. But the point is to try at the time of capture to ensure that you're doing everything you can to optimize the detail and to retain detail. Even if you know, for example, you're going to create a silhouette after the fact, I would generally try to capture a photo with as much detail as possible. And so make sure you're not clipping the highlights, ideally not clipping the shadows. Possibly, if need be, then you can capture multiple images, bracket images for an HDR. So if we've got somewhat extreme contrast here, we don't have much detail in the shadows. In this case, that happens to be an intentional decision, but we don't have much detail in the shadows for this photo, but that's because I edited the photo that way. But because of this scene, I actually bracketed my exposures for HDR, and you can separate those exposures by 2 stops for the bracketed set and just capture enough frames to encompass the full range so that you've captured the brightest highlights as well as the darkest shadows, that those are represented throughout that full range. And that you can just use automatic exposure bracketing in most cases to take care of that very easily if your camera supports that. But if you don't need the bracketing, then generally exposing to the right, getting the image as bright as possible, but without clipping highlights. That'll help minimize noise, as I talked about in my previous GreyLearning Live webinar presentation, but that'll also help ensure maximum detail. But keep in mind, we're capturing light, and more light is more information. Obviously, there's a limit. If you blow the highlights, then that's taking it too far. But the brighter the image, the less noise we're going to have, and that also translates into more detail. So, in effect, the presentation previously on noise is sort of what inspired me to have this conversation today, because detail is what we're looking for. Noise is usually what we're looking to avoid. Yeah, good point, Reed. If you're shooting RAW, you don't necessarily need to believe the highlight warning, because that's based on an in-camera processing to a JPEG. And so think of the clipping as being a little bit too eager to tell you that there is clipping. Generally, I still want to respect the histogram and the clipping preview on the camera. If you've got, like the blinkies display, for example, don't want to push that too far, but you certainly can recover a little bit of the overall detail. You can recover some highlight detail when you think it's lost, so to speak. In other words, you're not really recovering it. It just wasn't truly lost. Just the in-camera preview essentially was showing you that it looked clipped. And then, of course, we've got a great photo, hopefully right in the camera, and then we want to process to perfection. We want to do all the things that we can to improve the overall look of the image. And then for today's purposes, that is going to be focused on the level of detail. So making sure that we are revealing the detail optimally. What does that mean? Well, it depends. I'm going to talk about some examples here, but when it comes to detail, it's the right amount of detail for you and for the photo. More on that when we look at a couple of other photos, but I want to start off talking about maximizing the overall detail, the tonal range in the image. And again, there will be different decisions for different photographers and under different circumstances and for different photos. And so I want to show you, and I know much of this in the context of making these adjustments is going to be familiar to many of you, but there's some nuance to some of this. But first and foremost is setting the white point and the black point. And that effectively defines the endpoints, if you will, of the range of tonal values in the image, as well as therefore the level of detail in the image and the range of detail represented by those different tonal values. And so the way I approach, some of you I'm sure have heard me talk about the exposure setting. I like to joke that I don't need to adjust the exposure in post-processing of my photos ever. I just simply, if Adobe removed the exposure slider, I would be perfectly fine with that because I don't need it, which hopefully most of you recognize as being said completely tongue-in-cheek. I like to pretend that all of my exposures are perfect right out of the camera. And that might be the case sometimes, but it's certainly not the case all the time. And so the way I think about the exposure setting is quite literally an exposure adjustment. If you feel the overall image is a little bit too bright or too dark, then you can just adjust that exposure. And I actually don't even look at the histogram. I don't use clipping preview, which I'll talk about here momentarily, when I'm adjusting exposure. Why? Because I don't need to, because I'm going to check those things later, essentially. And so you certainly can make use of clipping preview. If you don't know what that is, hold on just a moment when we get to the whites and blacks slider. But with exposure, I'll just adjust by visual. Now, of course, I will have calibrated my monitor's display so that I know I'm getting a pretty good, accurate view of the image, hopefully. But the point is that I can just use an exposure adjustment to fine-tune. So let's say in this case, maybe I think the image should be just a little bit brighter. Have I clipped some of the highlights? I don't know. And I'm not worried about that yet. I am worried about that in the general context of the photo, but not at this very moment, because I'm going to use a different process to check. So certainly you could use that clipping preview for the exposure. You could examine the histogram while you're adjusting the exposure. I just don't do that because I'm going to get a more detailed look in just a moment. So again, as needed, adjust that exposure just to fine-tune the overall look of the image. But then when it comes to setting those endpoints, essentially setting the endpoints on the histogram, as it were. And so the way I think of this is that the whites slider is focusing its adjustment on the brightest areas of the image, and essentially think of it as stretching the histogram back and forth. So if I take the whites down to the left, so reducing the value for the whites slider, notice that the histogram has shifted, at least over on the right side, that's shifted over toward the left. So think of the histogram as being somewhat elastic in this regard. And if I drag the white slider over toward the right, notice that it's emphasizing that adjustment on the right end of the histogram, which of course is the bright highlights. And so the histogram gives us some clue as to, when we've taken things too far, or when we've toned down those whites too much, where now I don't have a true white, all the brightest pixels in the image are a shade of gray, for example. And similar concept for blacks, just focused on the left side of the histogram, emphasizing the adjustment on the darkest areas of the image. But the real beauty here is, oh, thank you. Thank you very much. You are correct. Let's see who, Jenny, thank you for pointing that out, that my head is in the way. That's probably often the case, isn't it? And so, but especially here in the context of sharing my screen with you. Yes, the histogram, so I apologize for that, but thank you for pointing that out. So I will repeat that white's there. I can drag that over to the left or to the right, and I'm effectively stretching the histogram or squeezing it. It's kind of an elastic histogram that I can squeeze and stretch in one direction or the other, but with an emphasis, in this case, on the whites, the brightest areas of the photo, or on the blacks. And so I can choose essentially how I'm positioning that histogram. And it's not really exclusively about the histogram per se, it's really about the photo. And so, to be honest with you, I don't even look at the histogram when I'm adjusting the whites and the blacks. You certainly can. We were just looking at the histogram once I got my face out of the way. But now, if I hold the Alt key on Windows or the Option key on Macintosh, when I adjust the whites, if I take that too far, I'll start to see an indication of clipping. So holding the Alt or Option key, hopefully, in most cases, I'll see all black to start with, meaning there's no clipping, but as I increase the value for whites, I'll eventually start to see colors and or white. The colors would indicate that 1 or 2 channels have become clipped. White would indicate that all 3 channels have become clipped, and that is usually a bad thing, especially when we're talking about optimizing detail. This would not be optimal detail in this photo, so I'm going to back that off. And the general idea is that with whites, I would increase until I start to see clipping, and then back off until I see either just a tiny little bit or maybe none at all, depending on the photo. Same concept with blacks. So here we hold the Alt or Option key, we get a white screen by and large, and as I reduce the value, I start to see where I'm losing detail in the blacks. And as a general rule, we'll see an exception here shortly, but as a general rule, I also don't want to clip much with the blacks, maybe just a little bit, so I have nice deep shadow tones. Again, we'll talk about the more nuanced ways that we will make those decisions here with some other images and with some other adjustments. And so, just finding the right point for the image, but in general, using that clipping preview, at least with whites and blacks. It is available, as I mentioned, with the exposure adjustment in terms of being able to see the clipping of those highlights, but I just simply save that for the whites and blacks in this particular case. And yes, Linda, so using the tone curve, so I'll just briefly switch here to the tone curve, and if we're in our parametric, if we're in our point curve rather than parametric option, we do have these endpoints, and that is virtually the same as the adjustment that you just saw with whites and blacks. And so I can drag those endpoints inward and similarly create, more clipping of the whites, or drag downward to create less clipping. So I can increase the value for whites by dragging the white point over to the left, or decrease by dragging downward. And so that does give us a very similar capability. The adjustment is effectively the same, other than there being some variability in terms of what the shape of that tone curve might actually be. But I want to emphasize that we should not become robotic when it comes to the adjustment. So setting the white point and the black point, for example. And so in this case, if we take a look at this image and I use the clipping preview, holding the Alt or Option key and backing off, and then using the black slider, so adjusting that white point, wow, I can't even get a true black in the image at all. So I guess I'll take it all the way to its minimum value here of -100. But obviously, well, hopefully it's obvious. I think it's reasonably obvious that this is not really accurate or optimal. Maybe you could say there's a little bit more detail revealed, but the image is looking a bit almost posterized and starting to break up a little bit here. So just keep in mind that while the clipping preview and taking that approach of setting the white point to be as bright as possible without clipping, for example, and then, of course, using the black point in a similar way, that works wonderfully well. So for an image like this, where we have good contrast, we want the brightest areas of the image to be very close to pure white, and we want the darkest areas to be very close to pure black. So that would be what I think of as sort of a more typical scenario when you're using clipping preview. But keep in mind that for some images, you don't want to have, you should not have, I'll even go so far as to say, you should not have a pure white point and a pure black point. This is a photo that a somewhat typical scene, shall I say, from the Seattle area. Well, from Seattle, literally, but not something we want to try to. Well, when I lived there, I did wish it would change, but not something we want to change in the photo itself. And so keeping in mind that, you don't want to just get robotic and always use the same adjustments in the same way when it comes to setting the white point and the black point. But then we get to what I think is sort of the real fun of it all, and that is being able to make adjustments that are more creative, where we can give it a little bit more thought in terms of how we want to approach the image. And so, for example, here we have a silhouette, and the scene, the subject naturally, of course, lends itself to a silhouette. Exposing for the sky, you effectively end up with a silhouette sort of regardless. Taking a look at the clipping preview, you can see in the original capture, not a tremendous amount of detail had been lost. I was just checking, to make sure I've not made any adjustments that would have tweaked that. So a little tiny bit of detail that's lost in the original capture, but this would be a type of situation where I might be willing to sacrifice detail. So taking that clipping preview and pulling back. Now, typically I wouldn't go to a full pure black, because now if I print this, for example, I've got this inky black area with absolutely no texture. So bear in mind that even when we have a silhouette, we usually don't want zero detail. We just want very, very little detail. And so for an image like this, I would tend to not clip extensively, just have a small area of pure black, and then I could use the shadows, which I'll talk about in more detail here in a moment, to push that down further if need be, to find hopefully the right balance. So here, I don't really feel the need to see any detail at all, really. I'll just go ahead and brighten up the shadows here. In fact, I'll zoom in there. You can see quite a bit of noise because it was a really dark area of the photos we talked about in the previous session on noise, but I can kind of pick and choose how much of that detail I want to reveal. And even with the default setting, reset that, we do have a little bit of detail in those dark shadow areas. But point being, with an image like this, it's perfectly fine to not have a lot of detail in the shadows, to have very minimal detail, in some cases possibly none. And so when it comes to those shadows overall, we can make a decision about effectively how much detail we want to reveal. And this, as I mentioned, it's going to vary from photographer to photographer, and it's going to vary based on subject matter. And so you probably have your own bias. I absolutely have my own bias. In fact, very, very long time ago, early in my photographic career, I worked for nature photographer George Lepp, some of you are probably familiar with. And this was so long ago that we were dealing with slides, with images captured on film, not digital captures in those early days. And so I would often scan slides if a photo needed to be used in a magazine article or a book, for example, and I would generally do the initial adjustment in Photoshop to get the image from the scan to a basic starting point at least. And George and I would argue, playfully I suppose, but we would argue about how much detail. So often I would bring a photo to him and he'd say, no, you need to open up the shadow detail. And I would say, no, we need more contrast in the image. Who was right? Well, in this case, they were George's photos. So, of course, he was right. He gets to make that decision. But we were at odds because I have a tendency to like a little bit more contrast and drama in a photo. And he, which is common among nature photographers, wants to be able to see every little bit of nook and cranny of detail in the image. And so with a photo like this, obviously not a landscape photo, but we have the option essentially to choose. So do I want to open up the shadow detail so that we can see more of the detail about the subject? Or do I want to take that shadow detail and darken it up to make it more dramatic? And so if I'm looking for a more dramatic type of a scene, if I wanted to emphasize the beautiful, colorful sky here around sunset, then I might darken up that foreground. But this is a photo of an airplane after all, and so I might actually want to open up the shadow details just a little bit more. And so once we have presumably adjusted the white point and the black point using the whites and blacks sliders, then it's time, and in fact, let's go ahead and take a look at that for this image. Just a little bit of lost detail where the sun is shining through there, not too bad. And for the blacks, a little bit of clip detail, but not a real big problem. But I might want to open up those shadows further, kind of a fill flash type of effect. Now, being careful not to let things go too far where you start to get this sort of flat, muddy type of a look, a lack of contrast in the image, but finding the right balance for those shadows. We want to open up the shadows or tone them down. In this case, I would want to open them up just a little bit to reveal more detail of the airplane set against the colorful sky. But then there are other situations. So an image like this, I'll go ahead and set the white point and black point. You can see just a little bit of bright highlights, probably not exactly specular highlights, but maybe off some of the bright lichen there, getting a lot of reflection. So I'll optimize the black and white. But here again, part of the reason that I took this photo, or one of the things that caught my eye about this scene, was the strong shadows. And so one could argue that you want to reveal the detail in those shadows, that you want to brighten up the shadows so we can see more of the texture and detail. We're trying to optimize the detail after all, aren't we? Well, yes, but not always. And for me especially, when there's dramatic light, don't we want dramatic contrast for the image? And so with an image like this, let me reset shadows. This is how essentially it started, other than a little minor adjustment to the black and white point there. But I would tend to pull down the shadows in this case to get a little bit more drama in those dark shadows, to get more contrast in the overall image. Again, it's primarily a matter of personal preference in terms of what you prefer as a photographer, but also take into account the subject. I do tend to darken the shadows, but with this image, for example, I would tend to open up those shadows a little bit. So go against my own bias and do what's right for the picture, what feels like it's the right thing to do for the picture. And with this image in particular, I think is a good example of an exception, in part because it's kind of sort of a landscape photo. And so at least it's just not the expansive kind of landscape that we might be accustomed to in many cases. But setting the black and white point, and then I'll talk more about highlights in a moment. Well, more. I haven't really talked about highlights at all, other than mentioning it in passing. But adjusting the shadows, and again, I tend to darken shadows to get more contrast and more drama in the image. But with this image, I actually want to open up, because over here on the right side of the image, little forested area there, at the default, it's a little bit too dark, effectively. And so I'm not able to see as much detail as I would like. And so I would tend to open up just a little bit. It doesn't take much to open up those shadows just a little bit so that we can get a little more, we're revealing a little more detail. And so, it can be a subtle thing where we are revealing just a little more detail, but that minor adjustment, the minor change, can really make a big impact on the overall image in terms of the level of detail that we're revealing. And as I mentioned, of course, there's the highlights slider as well. And the highlight slider is interesting. It's less I suppose, straightforward or sort of obvious as compared to the shadows slider. I find the shadows adjustment tends to be, I think, a little bit more straightforward in the way it tends to be implemented. But the highlights is actually in some ways almost more important for many images anyway, where we have relatively bright areas within the photo. And so if we, once again, I think I've already got the white point here. Yeah, set pretty good. So when we've established the white point and the black point, and we've used the clipping preview to see exactly what's going on in the image, then in many cases you might find that it looks like we've lost detail. So even though I sort of know mathematically, I've proven to myself with clipping preview that I have not lost any detail in the bright areas of the image, and yet it sort of looks like I have. And so that's where the highlight slider comes into play. So I can set my white point at a relatively high level, so I have a good tonal range in the overall image, I have a good white point for the overall image, but I can then pull down the highlights in order to tone down. So I'm not giving up the bright white point effectively, I'm toning down the brighter areas, the bright areas of the photo. But one of the great things about reducing the value for highlights is not only are we now darkening slightly the brightest areas of the photo so that they're more readily visible, we're also adding contrast. In effect, if you're familiar with the clarity adjustment, which I'll talk about shortly, when you reduce the value for highlights, you're effectively adding a little bit of clarity as part of that process. You're getting a little bit more contrast, which makes the detail that is there. We already know it's there. We didn't lose any detail. I proved that with clipping preview, but now we're making it more readily apparent, more visible within the image. And, oh yeah, and I see actually, Anne, a good question here regarding the airplane that we're taking a look at. Could you open up the shadows but then use a mask and work it to on the background, to work on that background? Yes, you absolutely could. In this case, that'd be a little bit tricky on account of all the little detail. There's a crop duster, so all the sprayers and the tubing and everything, there's a lot of little detail that'd be tricky to mask. But yes, you most certainly could apply a global adjustment in terms of the shadows in that particular case, for example, and then use a mask. Similarly here, maybe I would want to select the background or everything except the iceberg, for example, and maybe darken everything else down. So certainly we could get into some masking, which only takes things even further in terms of how we're emphasizing detail in a photo. And so just one more on highlights here. And I think in this case, just a little bit of clipped detail in the original. So try to recover as much of that as I can. But here, once again, reducing the value for highlights, and notice how it's making the detail stand out more. So as I drag that value for the slider value for highlights downward, yes, I'm darkening the bright areas of the photo, but I'm also enhancing contrast in those areas, which can be really quite incredibly helpful. And then one last example here in this category anyway, in terms of the shadows and highlights, and that is being able to optimize. So I mentioned when I showed this image earlier that it was an HDR image, and so taking, I believe in this case it was 5 exposures and blending them together. And so then we've got a situation where even with HDR, we've got the brightest lights, literal lights and specular highlights that have some clipping. I'll let that stay as it is. Black point I could pull up just a little bit so I don't have too much in the way of a pure black area. But then also in this particular case, I would say one of the more significant adjustments would be to open up those shadows. But notice the image overall is so dark that I'm not making much progress in that regard. So another example of a situation where we need to compensate for the overall exposure, which typically is something that I would do first with an image like this, but adjust that overall exposure, perhaps somewhere around there. Then I'll revisit the white point, and the black point can be adjusted downward a little bit there. And then of course, refine. So, another example of a situation where, yes, I can open up more detail in the shadows, but I don't necessarily always want to do that because it may start to get the image looking a little bit washed out, a little bit muddy, a little bit of lack of contrast. And so kind of balancing that adjustment. All right. And then moving right along, one of, I would say, my favorite adjustments would be the clarity adjustment. So in the presence section here, if you're using cloud-based Lightroom or cloud-focused Lightroom, shall I say, or if you're using Camera Raw, if you're on the Photoshop side of things, then those would be found in the effects section rather than the basic adjustments. And so we have here texture, clarity, and dehaze. I'm going to deal with each of them separately, even though in many cases I'll use all of them together. And so the overall adjustment, so in recognizing in some cases, detail, it's not necessarily lots of fine detail, lots of texture, coarse textures in the image. Sometimes it's very subtle. So here, a photo of reflections of color on a canal in Venice, Italy, and not much in the way of overall detail, rather smooth textures overall in the image, but still being able to enhance that detail as desired using clarity. So with texture, clarity, and dehaze, as a very general way of approaching these, I recommend thinking of them essentially as sharpening, being similar to sharpening. Because with sharpening, what we're doing is enhancing contrast where contrast already exists. We're focusing our contrast on our contrast enhancement on the contrast edges within the image. And I will show you sharpening on its own here shortly as well. So clarity is similar to sharpening. It's just happening at a larger scale. And so if you're familiar with sharpening adjustments, think of the radius as being a large setting, a high setting when we're adjusting clarity. And so as I increase the value for clarity, I'm enhancing mid-tone contrast, which can really help to make detail in the photo pop. And even here, not a very detailed photo per se, but we can see a bit of that additional contrast. I can also use a negative value for clarity to tone down that contrast, get a smoother appearance, almost sort of an ethereal glow type of effect to the image. It can also be used to soften down textures, skin tones, and that sort of thing, or to take an image that's already somewhat abstract and make it look a little bit more like a painting. So something that you might consider from time to time. For me, especially in the context of detail, I have a tendency to use a positive value for clarity, just to enhance the overall mid-tone contrast and therefore enhance the perceived texture or detail in the photo. And just switching to another image and similarly increasing that value for clarity, and you can see this significant difference. Now, it probably becomes relatively obvious that we're affecting other aspects of the image than we necessarily intend to. In other words, that one adjustment is going to affect the results of another adjustment. And which really means that when we apply various adjustments, we need to keep an eye on the image and evaluate whether it's done something that we need to change. And so, for example, here I did set the whites and blacks. I didn't set the highlights and shadows yet. I went right to clarity with this particular image. And, negative value, again, looking a little bit almost kind of cartoonish and with a loss of detail, but enhancing that detail. But as I increase the value for clarity, my reaction starts to be that, some portions of the image start to look a little bit too dark. The shadow areas are looking a little bit dark. And so I might come back to shadows, whether or not I had adjusted it previously. And so I can still open up the shadows to brighten that up a little bit, even though I'm also enhancing contrast with clarity. So one adjustment is going to impact what you want to have set for another adjustment. And so in many cases, you might find yourself sort of bouncing back and forth between different categories or sections of adjustments, as well as related adjustments. So, you adjust the exposure, then you come back to the white point and the black point, and you need to fine tune that. And then you come to the highlights and shadows, you need to make changes there. Then clarity. Well, now you have to go back to highlights or back to shadows, as the case may be, and further refine that. So just because you've painstakingly found just the right setting for shadows doesn't mean you're finished, because if you apply other adjustments, such as in this case clarity, you may find that it affects what the final adjustment for shadows in this case, for example, ought to be. So do keep in mind that there is an interaction. All of these adjustments are affecting, for example, focusing their adjustment on specific tonal values, or at least adjusting tonal values in various ways. So clarity will darken up the darks, and shadows, we can use the shadows adjustment to brighten up the darks, but we might need to mix and match, go back and forth in between them to continue finding just the right balance. But again, those adjustments can really be significantly impactful. So in fact, let me reset clarity and you'll see the image already starts off with a reasonable amount of texture. Obviously, it's a little bit of a long exposure. What was it, 1/10 of a second in a fast-moving stream in Austria? So, reasonable amount of texture, but it's the texture that I really like. Even though I was blurring the texture with motion blur with a longer exposure, I like the texture that's left behind, and so I actually like to enhance that. And so again, increasing that value for clarity to enhance that mid-tone contrast. But also keep in mind, I'm going to talk about texture here with a couple of other images, but the texture adjustment is very similar to clarity. It's operating at a smaller level, at a smaller size, you could say. And so as I increase the value for texture, notice that it's the smaller little nooks and crannies, the tiny little bits of texture in the water. The finer texture is being affected by the texture slider, whereas the clarity slider is happening at a larger scale. And you might even find sometimes you want to tone down the texture, but enhance contrast for overall midtones. So I could use a strong negative value for texture, for example, getting rid of all the fine detail, but then enhancing the midtone contrast, shall we say the medium detail, and ending up in this case then with this sort of abstract painterly type of an image. It looks more like a painting in many respects than a photo. I happen to like having lots of texture for this photo though, so pushing those finer textures. So again, clarity and texture, they're both affecting contrast. They're just doing so at different scales. So think of clarity as our medium level for medium-sized contrast, if you will, and texture as being more fine detail. Texture, therefore, being closer to sharpening in terms of how it affects the image. And then looking at texture sort of all by itself, focusing on texture. So whenever we have a photo, so the elephant has very fine texture. So if we get a little bit of a closer look, not just all the large scale wrinkles as it were, but on the skin itself, finer texture as well. So once again, if I'll zoom back in like that, once again we can see how that texture, it's like sharpening. With a positive value, it's sharpening. With a negative value, it's softening. It's focusing, very similar to sharpening, at a small scale, at a very fine level of detail within the image. But one of the things I think is important to keep in mind about texture and clarity is that in most cases I would say they should be used together. Almost always I find that texture and clarity should be used together. And the question is just the balance between the two. How much will you emphasize texture versus clarity? They're very similar to each other. Clarity being that mid-tone contrast, texture being the finest texture, closer to sharpening. And so trying to find the right balance there. And to me, what it really comes down to is I'm really trying to fine-tune and enhance and emphasize the finest details. If it's a wood grain, for example, or as we'll see with the next image, a rock texture, or here, the skin texture, is it those tiny fine details that I'm trying to enhance? Or is it more just kind of general mid-tone contrast? The decision there, which of those is more important, will impact kind of the balance of the two adjustments. And so if I'm mostly focused on mid-tone contrast, my tendency is going to be to use a higher value for texture than I did for clarity. So if it's the really, really fine detail that I want to enhance, more texture, less clarity. If it's not so much the tiny texture, but it's more the overall mid-tone contrast that I want to enhance, the larger areas of detail in the image, then I would tend to use a higher value for clarity than I would use for texture. But I think more importantly is just to think about the difference between the two. There's obviously some overlap in terms of how they're affecting the image. So think about how they're affecting the image, which is more important, but ultimately just evaluate the photo. Understand that texture is for the finest detail and clarity is for the larger detail, mid-tone contrast essentially. And so understanding how they are different, they're obviously very similar to each other, but understanding how they're different will enable you to make a better decision about which of those adjustments might be more important, which one you might apply a bit of a stronger effect to, for example. So similarly, looking at the Moai statue here, if I increase clarity, I'm getting enhanced contrast, mid-tone contrast. I'm getting those darkened shadows, so I may or may not like that. Maybe I want to go in there then and open up the shadows a little bit more by increasing the value for the shadow slider. But to me, the clarity adjustment in this particular case was less important because I really want more of that fine detail. So I'm going to reset the clarity adjustment and increase the texture. And so notice that we're getting the individual details, all the little nooks and crannies of the rock and what I assume is lichen on the rock as well. So it really comes down to more of a texture adjustment in terms of what I think is more important for the detail in this photo. And then the clarity maybe is just kind of enhancing. So here being an example situation where I feel that texture is more important than the clarity adjustment, so I tend to go stronger with texture than clarity. And now that I've refined those adjustments, actually I don't need to open up the shadows as much as I did, so I'll pull that shadow value back down and zoom out so I can see the broader image. And in fact, I will turn off the visibility of the basic adjustments here. Of course, we've got a rather significant exposure change, etc. So more to it than just the texture and clarity, but I think you can appreciate that both of those become important for the photo. And so really just sort of experimenting. If you maybe, clarity's been around longer, you might have more of a tendency to jump right to clarity. Understandably, it's a fantastic adjustment, but don't ignore the potential of texture. So for example, here, as I adjust, I'll slide back and forth with clarity, and we're seeing more clarity, less clarity, and certainly enhancing contrast. But I'll reset that adjustment, bring in the texture, and now all of the tiny little details, the filaments, the beard on the wheat here, and all the bright specular highlights, all of those little bits of detail are being enhanced. And so if you think you need clarity, be sure to check out texture as well, because in many cases it might actually be the better fit for the image, even when you thought clarity might have been the optimal adjustment. And then clarity still potentially, but also notice with clarity, we're starting to cut through the haze just a little bit. So in the background of this image, there's obviously a little bit of haze, some dust in the air, and it's backlit with the sun just about to set over the hills. And so increasing clarity might not be the right move because I'm starting to lose some of the mood of the photo. In fact, maybe I want to use a little bit of a negative value for clarity to get more of that moodiness, to get more of that kind of ethereal feel for the photo, and then using texture to enhance the detail, the overall textures within the photo. And so for situations where you might have thought that clarity was the right fit, oftentimes texture is the better solution. And you'll find the opposite as well. Sometimes, as I explained earlier, you might want to reduce the value for texture, but then increase the value for clarity. But keeping in mind that very often, if you want one of these adjustments, clarity or texture, probably the image would benefit from both. And it's just a matter of what is the balance. Is it a positive versus negative value for each of those? And which one is a stronger adjustment versus maybe not as strong? Obviously, it all depends on the image and what you're trying to get out of the image, but being sure to pay careful attention to that. And then dehaze is the third of the trio there. And the overall, adjustment in that regard is similar to clarity and similar to dehaze, but not exactly. And so I see, by the way, a question here, how do you turn on and off the overall adjustments? And so for each of our sections, and thankfully not too long ago, Adobe added this for the basic section, we can click on the eye icon and release to reveal. So click and hold to see the before version, and release to see the after version. So obviously the color boosted here in this particular case. And so turning our attention to the dehaze adjustment among the trio of texture, clarity, and dehaze, dehaze will really cut through the haze. But that's not necessarily a good thing. So for this photo, the haze is kind of what made the photo. And so I'll reset that dehaze adjustment. In fact, I might even consider a negative value for dehaze. In this case, if I take that too far, then I've just made a foggy day and I can't see anything. But we might use a negative value for dehaze to make the image a little more ethereal, for example. So just because the scene is hazy doesn't mean we want to dehaze it, but obviously a very strong effect in terms of what's possible. In fact, I used to call the clarity adjustment a dehaze adjustment, but that was before dehaze was added as an adjustment. And so once, of course, dehaze became available, then it made no sense to continue calling clarity the dehaze adjustment, the haze reducer, because we have a proper dehazer, a haze reducing adjustment. But when we have haze, part of the reason I captured this photo is that it was hazy. because I think it actually works out very nicely in terms of making things a little more mysterious, as it were, for the layers of the mountains here in the Alps. And so if I say, well, maybe I want to cut it back a little bit. So I like the haze, but maybe it's too much. Well, I can use a real subtle adjustment for dehaze. Just increase it just a little bit. So again, negative value makes it more foggy. Positive value makes it more clear, but I don't have to try to take it all the way to an extreme. I can just use a very modest adjustment to enhance that contrast. So again, seeing the similarity between all three of these adjustments, they're all contrast enhancers or reducers with a negative value. It's just a question of the scale. So with dehaze, it's the largest scale and getting more intelligent than just enhancing contrast, trying to actually cut back on that haze as well. So trying to find just the right setting. But of course, there are situations where you don't like the haze that was there. And so then I might use a relatively aggressive setting for dehaze. So I'm taking this kind of hazy, another dusty day in the Palouse, which is somewhat unavoidable, but a dusty day in the Palouse. And so I can increase the value for dehaze, and that will generally work out quite nicely in terms of cutting back that haze. Don't need to go to an extreme, although you can sometimes get away with a rather strong adjustment for dehaze. But point being is that we can increase the value as needed. And so to Anne's question about contrast fitting in with the mixture in terms of texture and clarity, here this kind of gets to a little bit of that, in the sense that as we increase the value for dehaze, it reveals that there's still other potential for the image. And so while dehaze tends to be more of sort of a specialized adjustment in that it's a haze reducer, very often with photos where you want to reduce haze, you'll want to enhance the overall clarity and texture as well, the overall midtone contrast. So I might increase the value for clarity. So notice how that's still having a rather significant impact on the image. So I might increase clarity just a little bit. There are some fine textures in this photo, so maybe I want to enhance those fine textures as well. That starts to me to get a little bit overly crunchy looking, so I would tend not to do that, but it is something that is available. And so you can mix and match. And again, all of these adjustments being sort of playing with each other, interacting with each other on some level. And so, Anne mentioned contrast as well, which I think is a fun reason to point out that I generally do not use the contrast adjustment at all, because that tends to be more of a kind of blunt instrument when it comes to adjusting the look of the photo. Generally, I'll use the presence adjustment, so texture, clarity, and dehaze, to enhance overall detail and midtone contrast, and then really using highlights and shadows as my primary tools for adjusting the light areas and the dark areas. Obviously, having established the white and black point with clipping preview as we saw earlier, but then being able to fine-tune with highlights versus shadows to open up or tone down the shadows, brighten or darken the shadows, brighten or darken the overall highlights as we see fit. And I think it's also worth pointing out that, and this topic can come from both directions effectively, and that is black and white. So sometimes the detail in an image is what causes me to decide that an image should be black and white. Or if I decide an image should be black and white, then very often I want to be focused on detail in the image. And so making sure that I'm paying careful attention to that detail. So here, for example, this photo was all about the light and shadows, the interaction of light and shadow, both the stairs and then the shadows from the buildings coming in from the side here. And so an image that I think is worthy of, or a good candidate for converting to black and white, and then paying careful attention, of course, to the level of detail. And so all of the adjustments that we've talked about thus far, so setting that white point and the black point optimally. In this case, a scenario where I certainly would darken up those shadows and certainly increase, most likely, the value for clarity, because it's the detail, the difference between the lights and the darks, that I really want to emphasize, that I want to embellish with a photo like this. So here, an example of a little bit more emphasis on general contrast, mid-tone contrast in particular when it comes to that clarity adjustment. But then another example, converting once again to black and white, and where there's a fair bit of contrast, but this image to me just sort of needs a little bit of everything. And so my go-to is often to start with clarity, and for this particular photo, certainly enhancing the texture, but contrast is still not quite there. And so pulling down those shadows and keeping in mind that, all of these adjustments, once again, are sort of interacting with each other. There's an interplay. And so if I'm not getting to the point where I feel those shadows are quite looking right, I can even pull down the exposure just a little bit, darken the overall image so I can get some really nice deep dark shadows. Just then be sure to revisit the settings for whites and blacks, for example, and maybe bring the shadows back up a little bit when I took the exposure down further. But again, fine-tuning the overall contrast in the photos. I mentioned from the very beginning that texture is defined by tonal values in the image, by contrast in the image. And so if you always keep in your mind that when it comes to detail, what we're really talking about is contrast, and how are we enhancing or toning down that contrast, maybe focusing on the shadows versus the highlights differently, clarity, using all of these adjustments to help us get maximum detail in the photo. And then sharpening can play a role as well. And this is something that kind of tends to be a little bit less of a consideration and less thought of, less commonly thought of, I guess I would say. And so in terms of adjusting the image, it's one of the earlier things that I have a tendency to look at, but I did want to mention it here, just at least in terms of getting a better sense of sharpening in the context of detail. Sharpening is after all found in the detail section. So that certainly would seem to suggest that when we're talking about detail, we ought to pay attention to sharpening, but also keep in mind that sharpening is really compensating for the some degree of loss of sharpness in the original image. And so it's not, I don't think it should be thought of as a creative adjustment per se. So sharpening really being about the initial adjustment, the initial sharpness of the image. So I'm going to click on my target icon here, and I'll go click into an area of the photo that I want to preview so that I'm viewing it at 100% here, or I can just switch my preview size to 100% and then look at an area of the photo, because I do recommend evaluating sharpness at a 1-to-1 ratio, meaning that you're looking at actual pixels, a 100% zoom setting where 1 pixel in the image is represented by 1 pixel on the monitor display. And then we can adjust our sharpening with the amount, radius, detail, and masking. And so we'll start off, of course, with amount and radius. So amount is the strength of the sharpening effect, and radius is the size of the sharpening halos. So think of it as the radius is sort of enabling us to shift, if you will, from more of a texture type of adjustment to more of a clarity type of adjustment. And so how do we make a decision? Well, we can evaluate the image as we're changing the slider values, but here again, a preview option will make it a lot easier. So if you hold the Alt key on Windows or the Option key on Macintosh, while we're adjusting the amount, that will give us a black and white version of the image. And so we can see there's minimum sharpening, meaning no sharpening, and there's maximum. And so we can evaluate the strength of the effect there more readily with that preview. So holding the Alt or Option key while dragging the slider. Radius, again, determines the size. So is it more of a texture type of adjustment, or is it more of a clarity type of adjustment? So how far outward from the contrast edges shall the contrast enhancement apply? Once again, holding the Alt or Option key, we get this embossed view that shows us effectively what amounts to a mask for the sharpening effect, in a manner of speaking. So we can see the bright areas and the darker areas, indicating where those contrast enhancements will be happening. And then detail, it enables us to determine to an even greater extent, are we getting more and more like texture with a high value, once again holding the Alt or Option key on the keyboard to get this preview, or more like clarity with a low value. So if you're really trying to enhance all the little nitty-gritty details in an image, then you might increase the value for detail. And then finally, masking. For that, I'm going to zoom out and once again hold the Alt or Option key, because with masking, quite literally now, we're going to mask the image based on texture within the photo. So holding the Alt or Option key, we see the minimum value that we have an image that is entirely white, meaning that we are sharpening the entire image. But as I increase the value, the smooth areas of the image will start turning black. And so as I go further and further and further, I get to the point where I'm only going to be applying sharpening to the highest contrast edges in the image. And so I can effectively choose, I'm only sharpening the white areas. So where do I want to place that sharpening? The entire image, just kind of cut out more or less the sky in this case, or cut out most of the image except the highest contrast edges. And so just by using those previews, holding the Alt or Option key on the keyboard makes it possible to enhance that detail. And so, again, something that I find to be very helpful using that preview, especially as you're getting to know these adjustment settings better, and then even as you're fine-tuning. Now, of course, we then want not a wild setting for radius, so if I zoom in once again, we can use that preview as we'd like and get a better sense of the settings. So typically for radius, high detail image, if you're looking for more of a texture type of effect, a value of about 1 or a little bit less. And if you're looking for more of a kind of clarity type of adjustment, then somewhere between 1 and 2 is typically going to be a good value. And then sharpen the taste, just be sure not to over sharpen and start to get too much of a crunchy appearance. Again, keeping in mind, at this point, sharpening is really being used to compensate for the original image having lost a little bit of sharpness. This is not where we're applying creative sharpening or output sharpening, for example. And yes, I see Robert mentioned the high pass filter in Photoshop. And so the technique referred to there, if you make a duplicate of an image layer and apply the high pass filter and change the blend mode to the overlay blend mode typically, and adjust the opacity of that layer, that gives us, it's often referred to as high pass sharpening. I would say though it's much, much closer to the clarity adjustment in terms of the actual effect on the photo. And then finally, before we wrap up for today, I did want to emphasize the HDR. So in this case, for example, an image that benefited from HDR in terms of both shadow detail as well as highlight detail, but we can perform all of that right within Lightroom Classic. Lightroom Camera Raw as well, if you're not using Lightroom, has the ability to assemble to HDR. And so if we use the photo merge command, in this case, of course, being HDR, and I won't go into great detail here in terms of the settings, but just to point out that if we want to maximize detail, we can actually capture a bracketed set of exposures, merge those together into HDR. So again, I won't worry about the settings here. The short answer is turn on the checkboxes and then deghosting, just depending on whether there was movement within the frame. But merge those images, and now we've got all of the detail taken from, in this case, 5 exposures, all of that merged into a high dynamic range image, which then gives us greater flexibility in terms of the overall adjustments that are being applied. And so, enhancing the degree to which we're able to get more detail out of the photo and really emphasizing that detail within the image. All right. And so I'm sure there probably were some questions. I will go back through the chat afterwards and see if there were any additional questions there that ought to be addressed, but I don't see any questions submitted to the form. If you're catching that late, I don't check the form as often as I otherwise would when I'm not presenting. That form that I link to, which in fact, let's go ahead and bring that back up since I'm talking about it. If you've got questions, I don't check it as often in between presentations, mostly looking at it during presentations, but you can feel free to submit questions after the fact as well, and I'll try to take a look at those. So feel free, timgray.me/question if you want to submit any questions. But in the meantime, thanks very much. I do want to mention once again the updated video training courses at GreyLearning.com on Lightroom Classic, the other Lightroom, Photoshop, and Adobe Bridge, all those comprehensive courses that have been updated recently. And you can learn all about those at GreyLearning.com. And then next week, starting May 20th, so if you're watching live and not tuning into a recording after the fact, you can check out the Lightroom Virtual Summit will be happening next week. And I will be presenting 3 sessions, one on using collections and folders in Lightroom, one on using the cloud in the context of Lightroom Classic. Even though it's focused on local storage, you have cloud-based storage there available as well. And I'll also have a session on advanced color adjustments. So you can learn more at timgrayphoto.com/Lightroom24. It is free, but you do take a look at the VIP Pass option, because with that, you get access to the recordings of all presentations forever. You get class notes from each of the instructors, detailed class notes. I put quite a bit of time into putting the class notes together for my classes, and those are available as PDF documents if you get the VIP Pass, and some other bonus content as well. So I'll hope to see some of you next week for the Lightroom Virtual Summit. In the meantime, again, thank you very much for joining me today for this presentation as part of the GreyLearning Live webinar series, and I'll hope to see you back for another webinar soon. We won't have a presentation in June because I'm going to be out in the Palouse all month leading photo workshops, but I promise I'll be back in July with another presentation. So thank you all very much. Have a great rest of your day.